In the heart of the empire's capital, a grand banquet was being held to celebrate the crowning of a new princess. It was a night filled with extravagant decorations, shimmering lights, and powerful people from all over the galaxy. Yet, amidst the luxury and grandeur, one man stood out. He was not a noble or a rich merchant, but a humble officer of the empire's military. His name was Kale, a soldier known for his sharp skills but quiet nature. Kale had been invited to the banquet due to his recent bravery during a skirmish on the border. He was unaccustomed to the royal gatherings, and while most attendees mingled and boasted about their connections, he kept to the edges, observing. His thoughts wandered, as he wasn't one to care about the wealth or the politics of the empire. He only cared about his duty. But as the night went on, something unexpected happened. While Cal was enjoying a quiet moment by one of the ornate windows, he heard a scream. Before he could turn around, a rush of people scattered, and a young woman in an elegant gown fell to the floor. Cal's instincts kicked in. Without thinking, he rushed forward, dodging through the crowd and reaching the woman just as a masked figure vanished into the shadows. The woman was unconscious, but Cal quickly assessed that she was not seriously hurt. He gently lifted her into his arms, moving through the chaos and towards the nearest exit. As he rushed, he noticed the shocked expressions of those around him. But he paid no attention. His focus was entirely on the woman in his arms. Once outside, he carefully laid her down on a bench and began checking her vitals. The palace guards quickly arrived, but Kale waved them off, insisting the princess was fine. His eyes softened as he looked down at her face, her delicate features and graceful presence. Even unconscious, she seemed like the embodiment of power and royalty. It was only then that he realized who she was, the princess herself. She had been crowned just days before, and her name was Lyra. The empire's people had spoken of her with admiration and fear. She was young, powerful, and destined for greatness. But to Kale, she was just another person in need of help. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked up, blinking in confusion. When she saw Kale, her expression shifted from confusion to something else, a kind of curiosity. Who are you?" she asked, her voice soft but strong. Kale gave a respectful bow, though he did not lower his eyes. "I'm Kale, Your Highness. I was only doing what needed to be done." Princess Lyra stared at him for a moment, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite read. Then, to his surprise, she smiled, just a little. It wasn't the smile of royalty that Cal had seen in portraits, but something more genuine. It made his heart skip a beat. "Thank you, Kale," she said. "You've saved my life tonight." As the guards moved closer to escort her back to the palace, Kale stepped aside. But before he left, the princess spoke again, her voice now tinged with a different warmth. "Stay with me for the night. I would like to talk to you." And with that simple request, Cal's life began to change forever. What started as a chance encounter was now a beginning of something unexpected, an impossible connection that neither of them knew they needed. Cal never expected the night to take such a turn. A simple invitation had led him to a royal banquet, and now a princess was asking him to stay. He couldn't quite believe it, but as he made his way through the grand hallways of the palace, he realized he had no choice but to follow her request. The palace was more magnificent than anything he had ever seen. Marble floors stretched out like rivers of ice, and crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their lights dancing across the walls. The walls were lined with portraits of past emperors and empresses, each one watching silently as Cal walked through the heart of the empire. When they arrived at the princess's private chambers, she motioned for him to enter. The room was elegant, yet it had an air of comfort to it, something Cal hadn't expected from a royal living space. The large windows gave a view of the city below, and the soft glow of the stars shone through. Princess Lyra stepped toward a comfortable chair by the window and gestured for Cal to sit. Her eyes were filled with something more than curiosity now, an intense interest that Cal couldn't quite place. "You've made an impression on me, Kale," she said, her voice calm and steady. Most people would have ignored the scream, or perhaps passed it off to someone else. But you didn't. You acted without thinking, without any concern for who I am. That's rare. Kale nodded, unsure how to respond. He was just a soldier, trained to follow orders. But for some reason, her words made him feel different, important perhaps. He didn't usually think of himself in that way. "I don't expect anything from you, Your Highness," Kale said carefully, not wanting to upset her. "I simply did what seemed right." The princess smiled, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "That's the thing, Kale. I've always had to do what's expected of me. I've never known what it's like to simply do what feels right. My life is a series of obligations, of decisions made for the Empire, not for myself." She looked out the window, her gaze distant, as if lost in thought. Kale watched her, feeling a sense of sympathy. He couldn't imagine the weight of ruling an entire empire, especially at such a young age. "I never had the choice," Lyra continued softly, "until now. You've given me something I didn't know I wanted. A glimpse of something real, something not controlled by duty or expectations." Kale felt the tension rise between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a strange kind of connection, one that neither of them had sought but somehow found. She turned to face him, her expression more serious now. "Stay with me tonight," she said again, this time more insistently. "Not as a servant, not as an officer, but as someone I can talk to. Someone who isn't trying to gain favor from me or the Empire. I need someone real." Kale was taken aback. What was she asking of him? Could he really stay here, knowing who she was? A princess, with all the power of the Empire at her fingertips. He was just a soldier. But something in her eyes made him want to say yes, something that pulled at him. I will stay," Kale replied, his voice steady despite the confusion swirling in his mind. "For as long as you need." And with that, Kale realized that his life had changed forever. The princess had invited him into her world, and there was no going back. What lay ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: he would never look at the Empire, or the princess, the same way again. The days following Kale's quiet stay with Princess Lyra felt like a blur. He had never been one for luxury, but the way she made him feel, like he mattered, was something entirely new. The palace was vast, its halls filled with the sounds of servants, advisors, and nobles. Yet every time Kale saw the princess, it was as if the world outside didn't exist. Lyra had grown fond of their time together. The initial meeting, awkward and uncertain, had turned into something she looked forward to every day. She found herself seeking him out, not as a soldier, but as someone who made her feel understood, something she hadn't experienced with anyone in her life. One evening, as they shared a quiet meal together in her private chambers, Lyra spoke of her life, her duties as the new ruler of the Empire. "I am always surrounded by people, Kale," she said, her voice soft, but heavy with the weight of her position. "I have advisors who speak of strategies, and nobles who have their own ambitions. But no one asks me what I want. No one has ever asked me about my heart." Kale listened quietly, his thoughts turning to his own simple life as a soldier. He had always known his place, obedient, dutiful, and without a desire for more. He couldn't understand the life of a royal, filled with so many expectations, but he could hear the longing in her voice. Lyra continued, her eyes searching his. "I envy the freedom you have, Kale. You are free to live as you wish, to make choices for yourself. But I cannot. Every decision I make is watched, judged, and often manipulated. I want to be more than just a ruler, Kale. I want to be me." Her words hit him deeply. He had never imagined that a princess, someone with so much power, could feel so trapped. He wanted to say something comforting, but he didn't know how to. Instead, he simply nodded, understanding more than she might have realized. That night, after the meal, Lyra invited him to walk with her in the royal garden. The stars above sparkled, and the moon cast a soft light on the lush greenery. The two walked in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Then, without warning, Lyra stopped and turned to face him. "Kel, do you ever wonder what it would be like to leave it all behind? To leave the empire, the palace, everything, and just run away?" Her voice was full of longing, as though she dreamed of freedom, yet couldn't imagine how it would be possible. Kel's heart raced as he gazed into her eyes. There was a vulnerability in her that he hadn't seen before. It was a side of her that no one in the court ever saw, the princess who was weighed down by the empire's responsibilities, but who secretly longed for something more. I have wondered," Kel admitted, his voice steady but full of emotion. "Not all the time, but I've wondered what it would be like to live without the weight of duty." Lyra smiled, her eyes sparkling in the moonlight. "Maybe one day we can find that freedom together, Kel." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Kel felt as if the world had shifted. He had always been someone who kept his distance from royalty, but now he was close to something he didn't understand. Something real, something that made his heart beat faster. It was clear now. The princess wasn't just seeking the companion. She was seeking freedom, and somehow, Kel had become the person she wanted to share it with. As they walked back to her chambers, Kel's thoughts swirled. The princess had asked him to stay with her, but now, it seemed like she wanted something more, something neither of them was ready to face. Yet, despite the uncertainty, one thing was undeniable. Lyra wasn't just the empire's new princess anymore. She was someone Kel could no longer ignore. The days after Kel's quiet walk with Princess Lyra felt different. There was an unspoken shift between them, a tension that neither could ignore. Lyra's invitation for him to stay in her private chambers had been a gesture of trust. But now, as they spent more time together, the weight of their connection seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. In the palace, things were changing too. The nobles and advisors who once overlooked Kel were now paying close attention. Whispers spread through the marble halls, and Kel couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He had always been a soldier, accustomed to following orders and staying out of the limelight. But now, as Lyra's personal companion, he was no longer just another officer. He was a part of her life, one that the court didn't fully understand. The first sign of trouble came during a council meeting, where the empire's most influential advisors gathered to discuss important matters. Kel had been asked to sit in the back, a quiet observer, while the discussions took place. But as Lyra's hand rested on the arm of her chair, her eyes occasionally flickering toward Kel, it became clear to the other members of the court that something had changed. There was a new closeness between them, a bond that went beyond the typical royal duties. "The princess seems quite fond of this officer, doesn't she?" one of the nobles whispered, his voice barely audible above the murmurs. Another advisor nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Too fond, if you ask me. A soldier, of all people. How could she risk her future with someone like him?" Their words stung, but Kel kept his gaze steady, refusing to show any emotion. The princess, however, could feel the growing tension in the room. She knew her relationship with Kel was starting to raise eyebrows, but she didn't care. She had never felt more alive than when she was with him. But the court, with its careful calculations and political games, didn't see it the way she did. They saw only a threat to their control over the empire. Later that evening, as the court emptied out and the palace settled into a quiet rhythm, Lyra sought Kel out in the gardens. The air was cool, and the scent of jasmine filled the night. Lyra's footsteps were soft on the stone paths, but her eyes were sharp, scanning the darkness. "Kel," she said, her voice low, "I'm worried. The court is talking. They think I'm making a mistake by being close to you." Kel stepped closer, his brow furrowing with concern. "You can't let them control you, Lyra. You're the princess. You have the power to make your own choices." Lyra turned to him, her face reflecting a mixture of fear and defiance. But I don't have the freedom I want. They won't let me. They'll find a way to use you against me. They'll find a way to take you away from me." The words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. Kel reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "Then we'll face it together. I'm not going anywhere." Her eyes softened as she looked at him. She had never felt this kind of connection with anyone. The way he made her feel understood, the way he was unwavering in his loyalty, gave her the strength she needed. But she also knew the danger they both faced. The court was powerful, and their influence stretched far. If they wanted to tear them apart, they could. "I don't want to lose you," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Cale smiled, his grip tightening on her hand. "You won't." But even as he spoke those words, the reality of their situation settled in. The Empire was not kind to those who defied its rules. And the princess, no matter how much she wanted to be free, was tied to it in ways she couldn't escape. The tension in the palace was growing, and Kel could feel the pressure mounting with every passing day. It wasn't just the court they had to worry about anymore. The Empire itself was watching, and it had no tolerance for the kind of bond they shared. Days turned into weeks, and Kel's life in the palace had become a strange mixture of duty and something more. He still served as a soldier, fulfilling his obligations with precision, but he couldn't escape the growing pull of his connection with Princess Lyra. What had started as a simple act of saving her life had evolved into something neither of them could ignore. Princess Lyra had become more than just a figure of power to Cale. She was someone who, despite her royal blood and the heavy weight of the Empire on her shoulders, sought him out for comfort and understanding. The more time they spent together, the more Cale realized how different she was from the distant, perfect image of royalty he had once seen. One evening, after a tense meeting with her advisors, Lyra asked Cale to join her in the garden. The air was crisp, and the stars were clear above, a perfect backdrop to the quiet moments they shared. As they walked together, the sounds of the palace seemed to fade away, leaving only the soft rustle of leaves and their footsteps. "You don't have to do this, Cale," Lyra said suddenly, her voice filled with something Cale couldn't quite place. "You don't have to stay by my side if it's too much. I can't ask you to risk your future for me." Cale turned to face her, his expression serious. "I'm not going anywhere, Lyra. I've chosen this. I've chosen you." The words felt strange in his mouth, but there was no hesitation behind them. He had never expected to feel so deeply for someone like her. She was the future of the Empire, a woman who carried the fate of millions on her shoulders. Yet it was her vulnerability, her desire for something real, that drew him closer. Lyra paused and looked at him with wide eyes, as if hearing those words for the first time. A smile, small but genuine, tugged at the corners of her lips. "You really mean that?" Cale nodded. "I do. You may be a princess, but you're also a person, Lyra. You don't have to carry the weight of the Empire alone." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of his words hanging between them. Lyra's gaze softened, and she stepped closer to him. Her hand reached out, brushing against his arm, as if testing the reality of what was happening. The touch was light, but full of meaning. "I've never had someone say that to me," she admitted quietly. "I've always been surrounded by people who wanted something from me. Power, status, influence. But you just see me, not as a princess, not as a ruler, but as a woman. That's more than I ever thought I'd find." Cal's heart clenched at the raw honesty in her voice. He had always thought of her as a leader, someone who commanded respect. But in that moment, he saw her for who she truly was, a woman caught between duty and desire, between expectation and her own heart. "I see you for who you are, Lyra," he said softly. "And I'm not going to walk away from you." Lyra smiled, her eyes glimmering in the moonlight. "Then stay with me, Cale. Not just as a soldier, not just as my protector, but as something more." The words hung in the air, heavy with promise. Kel's chest tightened as he realized that their bond had gone beyond anything either of them had expected. It was more than loyalty or duty. It was something deep and undeniable. But even as he stood there, holding her gaze, he couldn't shake the feeling that their connection would only bring more danger. The Empire was watching, and their growing closeness would not go unnoticed. But in that moment, none of that seemed to matter. What mattered was that they had found something real, something they both needed more than anything else. And no matter what came next, they would face it together. The tension in the palace continued to grow, thickening the air around Kel and Princess Lyra with each passing day. Their bond, once quiet and subtle, had become a subject of gossip and concern for the Empire's advisors. Lyra's every move was being scrutinized, and Kel, who had once been an invisible officer, now found himself at the center of attention. But neither of them could deny the pull between them. What had started as a fleeting connection was now something neither could escape. One evening, Kel was summoned to the royal study. The heavy doors closed behind him with a resounding thud, and he found himself alone with Lyra, her face serious. She was sitting at her desk, her fingers lightly tracing the map of the Empire that lay before her, but there was a weight in her gaze that made him uneasy. "Kel," Lyra began, her voice low. "There's something I need to tell you, something I've learned." Kel's heart skipped a beat. There was a quiet urgency in her words, something that told him this wasn't just another conversation. She was about to reveal something important. "I've been investigating," Lyra continued, her voice steady despite the storm brewing in her eyes. "There's a conspiracy within the court. Some of the advisors are planning to force me into a marriage with another royal family to secure the Empire's alliances. They want to control me, Kel, and they know they can't do that while I'm focused on you." Kel stood frozen, his mind racing. He knew the Empire had its share of political maneuvering, but he hadn't expected it to come so close to home. He had always been a soldier, used to fighting on the front lines, not dealing with palace intrigues. "But why are you telling me this?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Lyra met his gaze, her eyes sharp. "Because I need you to understand what we're up against. I've already made enemies in the court. If they find out how close we've become, they will use it against us. They'll tear us apart, Kel. And they won't stop until they've destroyed everything we've built." The gravity of her words hit him like a punch to the chest. He had always known there were risks to their growing bond, but he hadn't realized how deep the danger went. Lyra wasn't just a princess anymore. She was a target, and by being close to her, he had unknowingly placed himself in the crossfire. "I won't let them tear us apart," Kel said, his voice fierce. "I'll protect you, Lyra, no matter what it takes." Lyra's expression softened, but there was a trace of sadness in her eyes. "I wish it were that simple, Kel. But it's not just about us anymore. The Empire will never allow it. They won't allow you to be more than just my soldier, my protector. They won't see you as anything else." Kel clenched his fists, frustration rising in his chest. He had never been one to bow to authority, especially when it came to protecting those he cared about. And now, it seemed, he had to fight not just for Lyra's freedom, but for his own future with her. "We'll find a way," Kel said, determination hardening his voice. "We'll find a way to make our own future. Together." Lyra looked at him, her heart pounding. She had always been a princess, raised to follow the rules and do what was expected of her. But with Kel by her side, she felt something she hadn't known before. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they could defy the Empire and carve out a path of their own. But even as she held his gaze, she knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. They were standing at the edge of something dangerous, and the cost of their love could be higher than either of them were ready to pay. The storm had been building for weeks, and now it had finally broken. The whispers in the palace grew louder, the eyes of the Empire's elite more watchful. Kel could feel it in the air, a tension that seemed to settle deep in his bones. He and Princess Lyra had tried to stay hidden, but it was only a matter of time before their secret was exposed. It all started with a late-night meeting in the royal gardens. Lyra had insisted on speaking with Cale privately, away from the watchful eyes of the palace. They needed to make plans to figure out how to move forward before the court could turn their bond into a weapon. But as they walked together, talking in hushed voices, they both felt the cold presence of someone watching them. "I'm scared, Cale," Lyra whispered, her hand tightly gripping his. "They're getting too close. They'll destroy everything if we don't act quickly." Cale glanced around, his instincts on high alert. The shadows seemed to hide more than they should, and the soft rustling of leaves was the only sound in the air. Something was wrong. "Lyra, we need to move fast. The longer we stay here, the more dangerous it gets," Cale urged. But before he could finish his sentence, they heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. A figure stepped out from the shadows, one of the palace guards, his face set in a grim expression. Cale tensed, ready to protect Lyra at all costs. But the guard's words stopped him cold. "You're both under arrest," the guard said, his voice flat and emotionless. Lyra's face paled. "What? Why?" she demanded, her voice rising with panic. "The Emperor's orders," the guard replied, stepping closer. "You've been accused of treason. Your relationship with this officer is a threat to the Empire." Cale's heart raced. He had known the risks, but this was worse than he could have imagined. The court had turned against them. The princess, the one person he had sworn to protect, was now the target of the Empire's wrath. "We can't let them take you," Cale said urgently, his mind racing for a plan. Before Lyra could speak, Cale grabbed her hand and pulled her into the shadows, away from the guards. They ran through the dark corridors of the palace, the sounds of footsteps and shouts echoing behind them. They had no time to waste. Cale knew the palace better than anyone, and he had to trust that he could get them both out before it was too late. They reached a secret passageway, one Cale had used during his years of service. It led outside, away from the palace grounds, and into the wilderness. Lyra's breathing was shallow as they ran, her face pale but determined. Cale could feel her fear, but he couldn't afford to slow down. The Empire was after them, and they had no time to lose. When they finally reached the woods, Cale stopped to catch his breath. Lyra leaned against a tree, her eyes wide with shock. She had never imagined that her life would come to this, that she would be running for her life from the very people who once served her. "We'll be safe for now," Cale said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "But we can't stay here long. They'll be after us soon." Lyra nodded, her mind racing. She had spent her whole life in the palace, surrounded by power, but now she was out in the open, facing a future she never could have imagined. She had always known the cost of being a princess, but this was something she hadn't prepared for. They were fugitives now, hunted by the Empire she was supposed to rule. But as she looked at Cale, standing strong beside her, she felt a glimmer of hope. They might be running, but they were running together. And no matter what came next, they would face it as one. The cold wind blew through the dense forest as Cale and Princess Lyra pressed forward, their footsteps quick and purposeful. They had been on the run for days, traveling through the wilderness far from the palace. They moved under the cover of night, hiding in caves and abandoned structures during the day. But even now, Cale could feel the Empire's relentless pursuit, their search growing tighter with each passing hour. Lyra's face was pale, the strain of their escape showing in the dark circles under her eyes. She had never imagined her life would come to this, running from the very Empire she was born to rule. But Cale was with her, and his presence gave her strength, even when the weight of their situation felt unbearable. "We can't keep running forever," Lyra said, her voice breaking the silence. "Eventually, they'll catch up with us." Cale's jaw clenched, his mind racing. "I know, but we're not alone anymore. There are people who believe in us, Lyra. We've got allies." Lyra nodded, her thoughts heavy. She had always been surrounded by the Empire's court, but now everything had changed. She had seen the cruelty in the eyes of those who would stop at nothing to control her, to bend her to their will. But there were others who had secretly supported her, who believed in her vision for the future of the Empire. "We need to take a stand," Lyra said suddenly, her voice full of resolve. "I can't keep hiding. If I'm going to be the ruler I was meant to be, I need to face the Empire. We need to show them that we're not afraid." Cal's heart swelled with pride as he looked at her. Despite the danger, despite the impossible odds, Lyra was ready to fight. She was no longer just a princess bound by duty. She was a leader, someone willing to risk everything for the future she wanted. "Are you sure?" Cal asked, his voice gentle but concerned. Lyra met his gaze, her eyes filled with determination. "I spent my whole life obeying the will of the Empire. But now it's time for me to make my own choice. I won't let them control me anymore." Cal took her hand, a silent promise passing between them. They weren't running anymore. It was time to face the Empire, to confront the forces that had sought to tear them apart. It was time for Lyra to reclaim her future. They set out for the capital, where the Empire's power lay. As they approached the city, the air grew tense, and Cal could feel the weight of what they were about to do. The Empire would not let them walk away unchallenged. But Cal knew that no matter what happened, he would stand by Lyra, ready to fight for her, and for the future they both believed in. Inside the palace walls, the Emperor's forces were already mobilizing. The word had spread about the princess's defiance, and the Empire's elite were preparing for a final confrontation. But Lyra wasn't afraid. She had Cal by her side, and together they were more than a match for the Empire's cruelty. As they entered the palace grounds, Cal could hear the faint sound of footsteps behind them. They were being followed, but it was too late for the Empire to turn back now. Lyra's voice rang out, commanding and strong, as she stepped into the heart of the palace, ready to face the Empire that had sought to control her. "It's over," she declared, her gaze unwavering. "I'm taking back what's mine." The moment had arrived. The final battle for Lyra's future, and the future of the Empire, was about to begin. And with Cal by her side, nothing was going to stop her. The clash of steel echoed through the palace as Cal and Princess Lyra stood firm in the heart of the Empire. The halls, once filled with luxury and power, now felt like a battlefield. The Empire had never known a threat like this, and heir to the throne who had decided to take control of her own fate, with a soldier by her side, defying centuries of tradition. Cal could hear the sounds of soldiers rushing through the corridors, but he didn't flinch. He had known this moment would come. Lyra had made her choice, and he had chosen to stand by her, no matter the consequences. The time for hiding was over. It was time to fight for a future they could shape together. "Stay close," Cal said quietly, his eyes scanning the dimly lit hall. He could sense the tension in the air. The Empire was not going to let them walk away easily. Lyra nodded, her expression hard with determination. She had never felt more sure of herself. She was not just a princess anymore. She was a ruler in her own right, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that from her. "Let them come," Lyra said, her voice steady and calm, even as the sound of boots pounding on the floor grew louder. "I will not bow to them anymore." Cal gave her a quick, approving look. The fear that had once been in her eyes had vanished, replaced by the strength of someone ready to reclaim her destiny. She had always been strong, but now she was ready to prove it. The doors to the throne room burst open, and the Emperor's guards flooded in. Cal drew his sword, standing protectively in front of Lyra. The guards hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to proceed. They had always been loyal to the Empire's ruler, but now they faced a new reality. Lyra was no longer just a figurehead. She was a force to be reckoned with. "Move aside, Cal," one of the guards commanded, his voice low but filled with authority. "The princess is coming with us." Cal didn't move. Not today. Lyra stepped forward, her eyes locking with the guards. "I am the princess of this empire, and I will not be controlled by you any longer. If you want to fight, then fight. But know this, the Empire is changing, and I am leading it." The guards exchanged uncertain glances. This was not the princess they had known. They had always served her out of loyalty to the throne. But now, there was a new kind of power in her, the kind of power that came from choosing your own path. With a sudden movement, Kale lunged forward, engaging the guards with swift, practiced strikes. Lyra stood her ground, watching as the soldiers hesitated, unsure of how to handle the shift in power. But Kale was not alone. His training, his experience, and his loyalty to her had made him a formidable force. "Do you still want to follow them?" Lyra asked, her voice ringing with authority. "Or will you stand with me and the people who want a better future?" The remaining guards lowered their weapons, exchanging uncertain glances. It was clear that the empire they had served was no longer the same. Lyra had claimed her place, and there was no going back. As the last of the soldiers retreated, Kale sheathed his sword and turned to Lyra. They stood together in the heart of the throne room, victorious not through battle, but through the strength of their resolve. They had faced the empire and overcome it, not with violence, but with the courage to change. Lyra turned to Kale, her eyes shining with gratitude. "We've done it, Kale. We've changed everything." Kale smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "This is just the beginning, Your Highness. Together, we will lead this empire into a new era." And for the first time, the future seemed bright. The empire would no longer be ruled by fear, but by the strength of a princess who had fought for her freedom, and the love of a soldier who had never given up on her. The beginning of a new chapter had arrived. The morning sun broke through the clouds, casting a soft golden light over the palace. The battle had ended, and the empire had changed. It was not just the empire that was shifting, but also Princess Lyra herself. The princess who had once been confined by her duty, surrounded by the expectations of the court, had stepped into a new role, one she had never imagined. She was no longer just a ruler. She was a symbol of freedom, courage, and a future unshackled by tradition. Kale stood beside her, watching as she gazed out over the empire she was now ready to lead. They had faced impossible odds, defeated traitors, and turned the tides of history. The empire was on the brink of a new beginning, but Lyra knew that the final decision was hers alone. "Kale," she said softly, her voice distant but resolute, "I've spent my entire life preparing for this day. I've always known that one day I would have to make a choice. The people expect me to lead them, to restore the empire to its former glory. But now, I'm not sure if that's what I want anymore." Kale stepped closer to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. He had seen the strength in her from the moment they met, but now he saw something deeper, a woman torn between her duty and her desire for something more. "You don't have to choose between the two, Lyra," Kale said gently. "You can lead, but you can also live the life you deserve. You don't have to sacrifice your happiness for the empire's expectations." She turned to face him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "But what about the people? They need a leader. They need someone to guide them, to bring stability to the empire. If I walk away from it all, what happens to them?" Kale looked at her, his heart filled with admiration for her compassion. She cared so deeply about the empire and its people, but he knew that she had already made her choice. The burden of leadership should not come at the cost of her own happiness. "The people will follow you, Lyra," Kale said, his voice filled with conviction. "They will follow you because you're the leader they need, not because of some royal title. You've already shown them that you're willing to fight for what's right, and that's what matters." Lyra took a deep breath, her mind racing. She had spent so much of her life living for others, doing what was expected of her. But now, for the first time, she was free to make her own choices. "I've thought about this for so long," Lyra said, her voice steady. "I want to lead, but not as a prisoner to tradition. I want to change the empire, but I can't do it alone. I need you, Kale. You're not just my protector anymore. You're my partner in every way." Cal's heart swelled as he looked at her. He had always known that their bond was more than just duty or affection. They were a team, and together they could change the world. "I'll always be by your side, Lyra," he said, his voice filled with certainty. "No matter what choice you make, I'm with you." Lyra smiled, a sense of peace washing over her. The choice had always been hers, but now she knew what to do. She would lead the Empire, but she would do it her way, with Cal by her side, as an equal, not just as a soldier or protector. They would rebuild the Empire, not through fear, but through hope, strength, and the love they had found in each other. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Lyra took Cal's hand, ready to face whatever came next. They had already won the most important battle, the fight for their freedom. And now, they were ready to build a future together, one where they could lead with compassion, strength, and love. The Empire would no longer be ruled by tradition alone. It would be shaped by their vision for a better world.